December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. Sailors were having breakfast, families were getting ready for church, and America was still at peace. Then, at 7:48 a.m., everything changed. In just 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, and a nation that desperately wanted to stay out of war was thrust into the deadliest conflict in human history. But Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military attack. It was a psychological earthquake that fundamentally transformed the American psyche and shaped how Americans see themselves even today. Before Pearl Harbor, most Americans felt safe. Protected by two vast oceans, the United States seemed invulnerable to foreign attack. Sure, there was a war raging in Europe and Asia, but that was over there. The isolationist movement was strong, with figures like Charles Lindbergh arguing that America should stay out of Europe's problems. Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion of safety in the most brutal way possible. The attack wasn't just unexpected, it was unthinkable. The Japanese had traveled 3,400 miles across the Pacific in complete secrecy. They had struck American soil with devastating precision. Battleships like the USS Arizona exploded and sank in minutes. The attack came on a Sunday morning, a time associated with peace and worship, making it feel even more like a violation. President Franklin Roosevelt captured the national mood perfectly when he called it a date which will live in infamy. That single phrase became etched into American consciousness. It wasn't just about the military defeat, it was about betrayal, surprise, and the sudden realization that America was not as protected as it thought. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign enemies had successfully attacked American territory. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Perhaps the most dramatic transformation was how quickly America went from deeply divided to almost completely united. Just days before the attack, polls showed Americans were split on whether to enter the war. Isolationists and interventionists were locked in bitter debates. But after Pearl Harbor, the day after the attack, Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. Within weeks, millions of young men were lining up at recruitment offices. The armed forces grew from 458,000 in 1940 to over 12 million by 1945. People who had never considered military service suddenly felt it was their patriotic duty. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry that unified the nation. This unity wasn't just about military service. The entire country mobilized. Factories converted from making cars to making tanks. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Citizens bought war bonds, planted victory gardens, and accepted rationing of everything from gasoline to sugar. Pearl Harbor created a shared sense of purpose that transcended regional, class, and political differences. The attack gave America what every nation at war needs: a clear narrative. This wasn't about abstract geopolitical interests. It was about responding to a direct attack on American soil. It was defense, not aggression. It was justice, not imperialism. Pearl Harbor didn't just unite America for war. It transformed the nation's role in the world permanently. Before December 7th, America was powerful but reluctant, strong but inward-looking. After Pearl Harbor, isolationism was discredited, perhaps forever. The attack proved that oceans couldn't protect America anymore. The world was interconnected, and threats abroad could reach American shores. This realization led to a fundamental shift in American foreign policy. After World War II, instead of retreating as it had after World War I, America built a global network of military bases, formed NATO, launched the Marshall Plan, and became the leader of the free world. The Cold War, American military presence in dozens of countries, the role of the United States as world policeman, All of this traces back to the psychological transformation that began at Pearl Harbor. The attack also accelerated America's technological and military development. The sense of vulnerability drove innovation. Within 4 years, America had developed the atomic bomb. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would later warn about had its roots in the mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor. On a social level, the war changed America too. Women proved they could do men's work. African Americans served with distinction and returned home demanding the rights they had fought for abroad, helping spark the civil rights movement. The GI Bill transformed access to education and home ownership. Pearl Harbor set in motion changes that would reshape American society for generations. But we have to acknowledge the darker aspects of Pearl Harbor's psychological impact. The shock and anger of the attack contributed to one of America's greatest injustices, the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Fear, racism, and the trauma of Pearl Harbor combined to strip American citizens of their rights and property simply because of their ancestry. It's a reminder that national trauma, however justified, can lead to terrible decisions when fear overrides principles. Pearl Harbor also established a template for how America responds to attacks. The date, which will live in infamy, created expectations about national unity, swift retaliation, and total commitment. We see echoes of this in the response to 9/11, another surprise attack that transformed American psychology and foreign policy. Today, more than 8 decades later, Pearl Harbor still resonates in the American psyche. The USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii receives nearly 2 million visitors a year. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" still carries weight. Veterans of that day are revered as heroes. The attack remains shorthand for surprise, betrayal, and the need for vigilance. Pearl Harbor taught America that it couldn't hide from the world. It created a generation that believed in American exceptionalism and global responsibility. It established the idea that when America is attacked, the response must be overwhelming and decisive. For better and worse, Pearl Harbor shaped how Americans see their country's role in the world. It transformed a reluctant power into a global superpower, willing to project force anywhere on Earth. It created a military and intelligence apparatus designed to ensure that America would never be surprised again. Imagine fighting for weeks over a piece of land barely 5 miles long, where every cave could hide enemy soldiers, every palm tree could conceal a sniper, and surrender was not an option for your enemy. Where temperatures soared above 100 degrees, malaria was as deadly as bullets, and the smell of death was everywhere. This was island hopping, America's bloody, brutal campaign across the Pacific. From 1942 to 1945, American forces fought their way across thousands of miles of ocean, one island at a time, in some of the most savage combat of World War II. After Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled an empire stretching 6,000 miles across the Pacific. They held the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Indonesia, and countless other islands. The Japanese had fortified these positions with bunkers, artillery, and fanatical defenders who had been taught that death was preferable to surrender. The Pacific presented challenges unlike anything in the European theater. The distances were staggering. Islands were separated by thousands of miles of ocean. There were no roads, no friendly populations to liberate, no infrastructure to capture, just water, coral, and jungle. American planners faced a brutal math problem. Japan had fortified hundreds of islands. Taking them all would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and could take decades. The Japanese were counting on this. They believed Americans didn't have the stomach for that kind of bloodshed. So, American strategists, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, developed a controversial strategy: island hopping, or leapfrogging. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, they would bypass heavily fortified positions, capture strategic islands that could serve as air bases and supply depots, and let isolated Japanese garrisons wither without supplies. It was brilliant in theory. In practice, it meant that the islands they did attack had to be taken at any cost. The campaign began in August 1942 at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war, and nobody knew if American troops could match the battle-hardened Japanese forces. The battle lasted 6 months. Marines landed and captured an airfield, then spent months defending it in some of the most brutal jungle fighting imaginable. Soldiers fought in oppressive heat and humidity. They contracted malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery. They fought at night in dense jungle where you couldn't see the enemy 5 feet away. The Japanese launched relentless counterattacks. They employed banzai charges, mass infantry assaults where soldiers screamed and charged American positions, willing to die for the emperor. American troops had never experienced anything like it. The psychological impact was immense. How do you fight an enemy that prefers death to surrender? At sea, the Navy fought 7 major battles around Guadalcanal, losing so many ships that the waters became known as Iron Bottom Sound. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated, leaving behind 25,000 dead. America had won its first major victory in the Pacific, but the cost had been staggering, and this was just one island. Guadalcanal taught the Americans what they were up against. This wasn't going to be easy or quick. As MacArthur pushed through the Southwest Pacific toward the Philippines, Nimitz drove through the Central Pacific, targeting islands that could support B-29 bombers capable of reaching Japan. Tarawa in November 1943 shocked America. This tiny atoll was less than 2 miles long, but the Japanese had turned it into a fortress with concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, and 4,500 defenders who had sworn to fight to the death. The amphibious landing was a disaster. The tide was lower than expected, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns cut them down. Landing craft got stuck on coral reefs. Bodies floated in the lagoon. In 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 Marines died taking an island most Americans had never heard of. Newsreel footage of the carnage shocked the American public. Was every island going to cost this much? The answer, terrifyingly, was often yes. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, each island had its own horrific story. At Saipan in June 1944, American forces faced not just soldiers but civilians who had been told that Americans were barbarians. Hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender, convinced they would be tortured and killed. American troops watched in horror as women threw their children off cliffs and then jumped themselves. The psychological toll on American servicemen was enormous. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to have no concept of surrender, in a type of warfare that was more brutal and personal than anything in Europe. Not every island needed to be taken, but sometimes command got it wrong. Peleliu in September 1944 was supposed to be a quick operation, maybe 4 days. Marine commanders were told the island was lightly defended. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had changed tactics. Instead of defending the beaches and launching banzai charges, they had built an elaborate system of caves and tunnels in the island's coral ridges. They would let Americans land, then hit them from concealed positions. Every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and explosives. Every ridge had to be taken in brutal close-quarters combat. The battle lasted 2 months. Nearly 2,000 Americans died, and 8,000 were wounded, for an island that ultimately wasn't even strategically necessary. By the time Peleliu was secured, MacArthur had already invaded the Philippines, making Peleliu irrelevant. It was a painful lesson in the cost of military miscalculation. By February 1945, American forces were approaching Japan itself. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, was essential. Its airfields could support damaged B-29s returning from bombing raids over Japan and provide fighter escort for future missions. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic ash, caves, and tunnels. The Japanese had 21,000 troops dug into elaborate underground fortifications. They had learned from previous battles. They would fight from concealed positions, make every yard cost American lives, and hold out as long as possible. The battle produced one of the most iconic images of the war: Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi. That photograph gave Americans hope and became a symbol of American determination. But the reality behind it was horrific. The fighting lasted 36 days. Marines had to use flamethrowers to burn out defenders from caves. The volcanic ash made digging foxholes nearly impossible. Japanese soldiers would hide in tunnels during American bombardments, then emerge to attack. Nearly 7,000 Americans died, and 20,000 were wounded. Almost every Japanese defender fought to the death. Admiral Nimitz said of Iwo Jima, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." But the casualty rate sparked debates back home. Was it worth it? Could there be a better way? Okinawa in April 1945 was the last stepping stone before invading Japan itself. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. 183,000 troops landing on Japanese soil for the first time. The battle lasted 82 days and became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Japanese forces, knowing this was the last defense before the home islands, fought with unprecedented desperation. They launched massive kamikaze attacks against American ships, over 1,900 kamikaze missions that sank dozens of vessels, and killed nearly 5,000 sailors. On land, fighting was savage. The Japanese used civilians as shields, hid in tombs and caves, and continued tactics of hidden warfare. American forces faced constant rain, mud, and an enemy that simply would not surrender. Combat stress, what we now call PTSD, reached epidemic levels. Men who had fought through multiple campaigns finally broke under the strain. By the time Okinawa was secured in June 1945, over 12,000 Americans were dead and 38,000 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 100,000 soldiers dead, and perhaps 100,000 civilians killed in the crossfire. American commanders looked at the casualty figures and drew a terrifying conclusion. If this was the cost of taking one Japanese island, what would invading the Japanese home islands cost? Estimates ran to 500,000 American casualties or more. This calculation would play a crucial role in the decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than launch a conventional invasion. August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb fell from the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, Japan. In an instant, 80,000 people were vaporized, burned, or crushed. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more. By the end of the year, radiation sickness and injuries would push the death toll past 200,000. These two bombs ended World War II. They also started the most contentious moral debate in modern military history. Were the atomic bombs necessary to end the war and save lives? Or were they an unnecessary war crime against civilian populations? Nearly 80 years later, historians, ethicists, and the public still can't agree on the answer. The traditional justification for dropping the atomic bombs is straightforward. It saved lives, both American and Japanese. By the summer of 1945, Japan was defeated but refused to surrender unconditionally. The Japanese military still had over 2 million troops in the home islands, plus thousands of kamikaze planes and a civilian population that had been indoctrinated to fight to the death. The slogan was 100 million deaths with honor. The entire Japanese population would resist invasion. American planners had just finished the Battle of Okinawa, where 12,000 Americans died taking a single island. The fighting was so brutal, the Japanese resistance so fanatical, that casualty estimates for invading Japan were staggering. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, was expected to cost between 400,000 and 800,000 American casualties, with Japanese deaths potentially in the millions. President Truman had those numbers on his desk. He had seen the reports from Okinawa, where Japanese civilians jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. He knew that conventional warfare would turn every Japanese city into Okinawa multiplied by 100. The atomic bombs, proponents argue, were the lesser evil. Yes, 200,000 people died, but that was fewer than would have died in an invasion. The bombs shocked Japan's leadership into surrender, ending the war without the need for Operation Downfall. In this view, Truman made the difficult but correct decision that ultimately saved more lives than it cost. Supporters also point out that Japan had committed horrific atrocities throughout Asia: the rape of Nanking, Unit 731's biological experiments, the Bataan Death March. Japan had shown no mercy to its enemies and had rejected multiple surrender opportunities. The atomic bombs were simply the final necessary step to end a war that Japan refused to abandon. Critics of the decision argue that the atomic bombs were militarily unnecessary and morally indefensible. First, they point out that Japan was already defeated. By August 1945, Japan's navy was destroyed, its air force was decimated, and American submarines had strangled its supply lines. Japanese cities were being firebombed regularly. The Tokyo firebombing in March 1945 had killed more people than the Hiroshima bomb. Japan couldn't win, and its leaders knew it. The question wasn't whether Japan would surrender, critics argue, but when and under what terms. Japan's main sticking point was preserving the emperor. If America had been willing to guarantee the emperor's safety, which they ultimately did anyway after the surrender, Japan might have surrendered without the bombs. There's also evidence that Japan was more afraid of Soviet entry into the war than of continued American bombing. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with devastating effectiveness. Some historians argue this, not the atomic bombs, was what finally convinced Japan's leadership that the war was truly lost. The targeting also raises moral questions. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not purely military targets. They were cities full of civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. While both cities had military facilities, the bombs killed indiscriminately. Critics argue this violated the principles of just warfare, which require distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. The timing is suspicious, too. The second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki just 3 days after Hiroshima, barely enough time for Japan's leadership to assess the damage, verify what had happened, and debate a response. Was this really about forcing surrender, or was America eager to test both types of atomic bombs before the war ended? Beyond military necessity, there were political calculations that complicate the moral picture. The United States had spent $2 billion developing the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project. That was an enormous sum, about $30 billion in today's dollars. Truman had not been vice president when the project started, and he only learned about it when he became president after Roosevelt's death. He faced political pressure to justify that expenditure. Using the bomb provided that justification. There was also the Soviet factor. By August 1945, the wartime alliance between America and the Soviet Union was already fraying. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan, and his forces were poised to invade. But if the Soviets played a major role in defeating Japan, they would demand a major role in occupying and rebuilding Japan. Some historians argue that demonstrating the atomic bomb was partly about sending a message to Stalin. America has this weapon, and we're willing to use it. It was the opening move of the Cold War, establishing American dominance in the post-war world. In this interpretation, Japanese civilians were sacrificed partly for geopolitical positioning. This doesn't mean the military justifications were fake, but it suggests the decision was more complex than simply save American lives. One of the most debated questions is whether there were alternatives that weren't seriously considered. Some critics argue that a demonstration bombing on an uninhabited island could have shown Japan the bomb's power without killing civilians. Invite Japanese observers, detonate the bomb, and give them an ultimatum: surrender or face this weapon on your cities. But proponents counter that this might not have worked. What if the bomb failed to detonate properly? America only had 2 bombs ready in August. What if Japanese leadership dismissed it as a trick or propaganda? Japan had already endured massive conventional bombing without surrendering. Why would one more explosion change their minds? Others suggest that continuing the conventional bombing campaign and naval blockade would have eventually forced surrender. Japan was starving, cut off from resources, and facing internal collapse. Give it a few more months, and surrender would become inevitable. The counter-argument is that those months would have cost thousands more lives, both from continued combat operations and from starvation and disease in Japan. Every day the war continued, people died. If the atomic bombs ended the war faster, they were the more humane option. What about modifying the surrender terms to guarantee the emperor's position? Critics point out that America ultimately allowed the emperor to remain after surrender anyway, so why not offer that earlier and avoid the bombs? Defenders respond that this was only possible after Japan's total defeat. Offering it before might have been seen as weakness, encouraging Japan to hold out for even better terms. What makes this debate so persistent is that both sides make valid points. The traditional view, that the bombs saved lives by preventing an invasion, is supported by the evidence from Okinawa and the Japanese military's stated determination to resist. The casualty estimates for Operation Downfall were real, and they haunted American military planners. But the revisionist view, that alternatives existed and political factors influenced the decision, is also supported by historical evidence. Japan was defeated, Soviet entry did shock Japanese leadership, and the geopolitical calculations of the emerging Cold War did matter. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Truman faced an impossible choice with imperfect information. He couldn't know with certainty whether Japan would surrender without invasion. He couldn't know how long a blockade might take. He couldn't know whether a demonstration would work. What he did know was that every day the war continued, people were dying, and he had a weapon that might end it immediately. The decision to use atomic bombs wasn't just a military calculation or a political maneuver. It was both, tangled together in the chaos of total war. Truman believed he was making the choice that would save the most lives. Whether he was right remains the question. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki fundamentally changed warfare and international relations. They demonstrated that humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself. The nuclear age began not with a test in the desert, but with 2 cities turned to ash. The horror of those bombings created a taboo against nuclear weapons that has held for nearly 80 years. No nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki. For Japan, the atomic bombs became central to national identity. Japan transformed from aggressor to victim in its own historical narrative, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki serving as powerful symbols of the horrors of war. The Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, became living reminders of nuclear weapons' devastating power. For America, the decision remains controversial. Veterans and their families often defend the bombings as having saved their lives. Peace activists point to them as the ultimate example of warfare's moral bankruptcy. Politicians invoke them when discussing modern military intervention and nuclear proliferation. The debate over Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't just about the past. It's about fundamental questions we still face. When is killing civilians justified in war? How do we weigh certain deaths against potential future deaths? Who decides, and on what basis? These questions have no easy answers. Perhaps that's why 80 years later, we're still arguing about two bombs that fell on two cities in the summer of 1945.